Hey y'all, I'm Sarah. Welcome back to Widow Wit and Wisdom. Marissa will be back with me very soon. Just had a few tech issues. We're getting that sorted out. But today I am flying solo. Now today's episode comes with a huge trigger warning, not just for y'all, but for me too. This is a deep dive into suicide and suicide loss and just how different that kind of grief looks. So I ask for your grace and some space, and that you are in the right space and grace to listen to this one. My hope with this episode is that the knowledge and understanding that I have gained since losing my husband to suicide can help someone else out there grieving a loss to suicide or struggling with the darkness themselves, because the stigma surrounding suicide and suicide loss is huge. So I'm hoping with this episode to bring a little more understanding and hopefully some healing, because let's face it, people are just afraid to talk about this. So we're going to dive into that today. Everybody buckle up, buttercups, because here we go. Before losing Jeff to suicide in 2016, my knowledge of suicide was very limited. Of course, I knew the stigmas of it, the fire and brimstone of it, but overall, I had no personal experience with it until Jeff died. And then, of course, I was all up in it with personal experience. And let me tell you, with personal experience comes a total different perspective. And I think it's hard for a lot of people to understand that. For any grandparents out there, it's like, people tell you how great grandbabies are, but you don't really know until you know. But it brings just such a different view on things. Not only grieving as a widow really brings into perspective what's important, what's not, but losing someone to suicide narrows that even more, or it has changed me to my very core. And I became just very early on obsessed with finding out more about suicide. Like, one of the problems in suicide loss is there's just too many unanswered questions. And I needed to know more about suicide and suicide loss and how to deal with it in order to process what had happened so that I could get through this process of grieving. And in doing so, for the first time really ever in my life, I started to look up suicide. And of course, the very first thing that pops up is all the little cookies, call the hotline. And I was like, I'm not here for that. But the stats were appalling to me because we don't talk about it that much. It is such a stigmatized, taboo subject that I was completely unaware of the statistics on suicide, especially among men, which that is a huge problem that we will talk about further later. But I just couldn't believe the rates. And then when I saw the rates of suicide amongst family members of loved ones who died that way, I was even more just shocked. And then I was terrified. I was just like, oh no, this increases, everybody around me's rate of suicide. I can't lose someone else that way again. And I just dug into, I need to know as much as possible about suicide, how to deal with it, how to cope with it, what to look for as I can possibly find so that this doesn't happen to anyone else that I loved. There was just no way I could let this happen again, that I could lose like this. I was already just so completely shattered by it. And so again, I just dug in and I needed to know more about it. How do I fight this? Especially once my son was in the military. So that, of course, being an Army veteran raises your rates. And then on top of that, he lost his dad to suicide. Again, add more numbers. So I became just terrified of losing anyone else to suicide, or losing anyone else in general, but definitely to suicide, because again, beating myself up with all the, what ifs and if I could have and should have done this and should have done that. And also having the stigma thrown at me from losing Jeff by suicide, like other people asking me all these same questions in a blaming, sort of shaming way. And it became overwhelming quick, and I needed some way to process it. So I really just kind of started to read everything I could. And the problem was there just wasn't much out there. Again, you couldn't talk about it. And I got to the point where I found that my biggest problem with overcoming my grief was going to be simply getting over this stigma and the shame and the blame, not only from myself, but from everyone else. And that was really difficult to try to do, because it is coming at you from all directions. My entire upbringing was, you're going to hell if you die by suicide. But internally, I was like, there's no way that my beautiful soul of a husband is in hell, because he was already in hell here. He was burning in hell over everything that he was feeling. And wasn't that enough? And so it really made me, like, to my core values and beliefs, it shook me. And I needed to understand all of it better. And boy, when you really dig in and start looking at things, it changes your perspective on all of life, really, but definitely suicide. I know in dealing with the feelings and processing everything after losing Jeff, I actually had a much better understanding of why he could not handle the pain. And I felt that. I understood very quickly, because I was, after losing Jeff, I felt like a failure. I felt like I had failed him. I had failed everyone around me. My life was shattered. I didn't know what life was going to look like without him and didn't want to live it. I felt that extreme darkness. And as I sat there in it, I remember thinking, my God, if this is what he felt like, I never want him to feel that way. I loved him too much. And so it kind of gave me a little bit of perspective and understanding on what he did. Now, don't think for a minute it took any of the blame or anger, the feelings I had about it, but it did help me understand a little bit, because it just, that burden, I get that. And to have people and those you love to feel like you failed them, it's a heavy thing. And I don't think, unless you've experienced it really, truly to your core, that you understand that pain and that darkness that you face at the bottom of a spiral. And I just didn't want anyone else that I loved to feel that or to experience it. And I very quickly was just like, I'll take it. I'll take the pain. Just let me figure it out. But don't ever let anybody else I love feel like this ever again. I felt like I had failed Jeff, and that was hard to cope with. But I was also like, I cannot fail anyone else for him. So it became quite the conundrum. And as I really dug into it all, I had so many more questions than answers. And of course, with suicide, there are oftentimes no answers. But what I was able to get answers to were the simple things, like, why is the stigma so huge? Why am I, as a widow, not allowed to say, oh, my husband died by suicide, without people going, oh my gosh, change the subject, or asking invasive things or saying invasive things. So I started to really kind of look into that. And again, having my core values, my faith and religion and everything just sort of blown up in my face, I needed answers. So I started asking the hard questions in true Sarah fashion and really trying to find the answers. And let me tell you, what I found was almost like worse than the statistics. As I talked to more and more people about suicide and suicide loss, and I read more and more things about it, I really began to notice a pattern. And it was that shame that seemed to really be a huge driving force behind suicide. I had this kind of epiphany, and I just wrote, suicide may take them, but shame was wielding the sword, which kind of honestly gave myself pause after I wrote it. And I went, wow, yeah, shame was swinging the sword. How do we stop that? How do you how do you shield against the shame so that those blows don't hit the artery and have you bleeding to death? So I needed to figure out how to stop this, because I also realized that very same sword of shame was killing me too. And I absolutely did not want suicide to be the legacy left to my sons. So I needed to figure out a way to stop this. One of the first things I felt I had to figure out to fight this and stop the sword wielding of shame was to figure out where this extreme stigma and fear surrounding suicide came from. Because for me, that added a whole lot of weight. How was I supposed to heal this if I couldn't talk about it without fear of more judgment and hellfire and shame? Of course, I simply did not understand why we shame those who die by suicide and those left behind by it so severely when that's what killed our loved one in the first place. And it just at some point pissed me off. I was like, where does this stigma come from? I need to know, like, why is it so bad? So my first order of business was to tackle, where did this stigma come from? Why is suicide such a taboo subject? And so, of course, I did what you do. I hopped on Google and typed in, why is there so much stigma around suicide? And of course, once the cookies popped up of call the suicide hotline, I found one of the first answers was it was because of religion and people's beliefs. And I was like, oh, yeah, well, I get that, because I was raised in the Lutheran church and I was taught that if you died by suicide, it's one way ticket to hell, right? So yeah, I can see where the stigma definitely for sure comes from the church. But then as I got to thinking about that, I was kind of like, well, why does the church say that? Why was I taught that? Where in the Bible does it actually say directly, if you die by suicide, you're going to hell? And so I needed that question answered. I needed to know, was he in hell? And so I grabbed my Bible and I start looking up suicide, and there's really not much in there about it. Actually, it's kind of vague. And so I was like, okay. So where'd the church get that information? If I'm not finding it, maybe I just don't know my Bible knowledge, whatever. So I did what you do. I called the person that I knew the most about the Bible. I mean, he knows it all. I called my dad and I asked him, I said, where is it in the Bible? I need to know what passage it is that says that Jeff's in hell because he died by suicide. And I was expecting a fire and brimstone, of course, your husband's in hell, here's the passage, answer from my father. And that is not what I got. To my surprise, he said, well, actually, it's not in there directly. It speaks of a mortal sin, but it doesn't name the mortal sin specifically. And I was like, then where did the church come up with this? And suddenly I felt like, oh my gosh, all my beliefs have been shattered. So faith shaken. And I was just like, but now you're telling me that it's not that. So now my faith wasn't so much shaken as my faith in the church who had taught me that. And I was like, well, where did it come from? And he's like, oh, I don't know. So I called a pastor friend, the pastor of the church that I had grown up in, that I trusted. He was a dear family friend. I knew he would not throw any judgment and shame and blame at me. And so I just asked him, I was like, why does the church teach this? Because I can't find it. And he said, again, just what my dad had said, it doesn't say that directly. But he had more of an answer for me. He said, because I was like, I know I read this somewhere in church growing up. And he's like, you read it in your catechism when you were taking confirmation class. And I'm like, oh, okay. But the catechism took it from the Bible, right? And he said, well, no, not exactly. And I was like, what are you talking about? And he said, well, it turns out like a pope, and mind you, we were Lutherans, so we're like a step off a Catholic. He said a pope back in the 13th century decided to name suicide as the mortal sin, even though it doesn't exactly point that direction. And I was just stunned, but also at the same time, I was a little bit like relieved. The burden of the hellfire, at least for me, was lifted, because a man said that, not God. And at that point, I was not trusting any man's views or opinions. So once I had more knowledge and clarification on that particular stigma of the hellfire and brimstone and your beliefs, it no longer triggered me as badly when people would come at me with their beliefs of, oh, your husband's in hell, and the negative comments. It didn't hurt as bad because I knew in my heart of hearts and soul that he was not in hell. So having that particular stigma for me debunked really brought a lot of relief. But it also brought even more questions of, well, okay, that one doesn't hurt so bad. So what are some of these other huge stigmas and shames around suicide? Another huge stigma and shame point around suicide that I was very quickly aware of was he was selfish stigma. Now for me, that did not resonate exactly because I did not feel that Jeff's suicide was selfish. I just felt that he was very broken and could not handle this. And I understood that about him. I loved him too much to hurt like that. So I didn't feel that his suicide was selfish. Now I can understand why people would think that. I can, because he left this huge fallout, and that's what happens when there's suicide loss. There's a massive fallout and it affects everybody. And so when people would say that to me, it always kind of shocked me a little bit. And in the early days, I felt the need to defend that. I felt the need to defend Jeff. And early on, that was hard because here I am. I'm angry at him. I didn't see him as selfish, but I was pissed off that he had left me with this fallout too. And so I was mad at him, but then when people would call him selfish, I had to defend him. And that made my grieving process even harder. And while having that stigma of the selfishness did add a lot more weight and time to my grieving process, I have to say it has my reactions to someone saying that a suicide death is selfish have definitely changed over time. Again, I'm not as shocked by it. I'm pretty accustomed to it at this point, and I deal with it very differently now. Instead of feeling the need to defend my husband, I feel like it's none of your damn business, first of all. But also, secondly, who are you to call my husband selfish? You did not know him. So I don't feel the need anymore to justify it. You are welcome to your thoughts and opinions on whether suicide is selfish or not. I have my views on my own husband's death, and they are that he was not selfish. Now, I'm not saying that that cannot be the case. Yes, I'm sure there are people out there who very selfishly take their life in order to hurt others. My husband in particular, though, I didn't feel that way. So when people try to throw that at me, it doesn't hit as hard because I have the knowledge that that is absolutely not the truth. For me, that selfish stigma just doesn't fly. But I can definitely understand why it would fly and hit like a brick being dropped from the top of the Eiffel Tower. For some, I'm sure that it was a selfish decision. It hurts to have that thrown at you. So please, by all that is holy, keep your thoughts and opinions on suicide and where they are and whether they were selfish or not to yourself, because it is not always the case. Do not cast a broad stroke across suicide. There are so many tiny ins and outs and aspects to it that people just don't see unless they've been there. So please don't cast your judgments on it. Instead, I would ask you to cast on it your understanding and your empathy to the pain and the suffering that that person was going through. When you look at it from that lens, it is a very different place. Instead of seeing them as weak or selfish or doomed to hell, see the hell that they were already in, that those of us left behind by this are already in. And when you look at it from that perspective, the absolute burning, hopeless terror and fear, it might give you pause. And if it doesn't, then that's on you. It should give you pause. If it doesn't, that says more about you than them. If you can look at it from that perspective and see that pain, it changes everything. You have to factor that in before you can judge anything. So unless you've been there, again, don't judge it. Instead, face it, understand it, offer to bind those wounds instead of using your judgment and shame sword to further damage those of us left behind by suicide and suicide loss. It is in no way helpful when you add that onto the pile. So with suicide and suicide loss, if you drop the stigmas of weakness, of selfishness, of fire and brimstone, and you really just come at it with the compassion of, my God, how bad must they have been hurting? And how do I not allow someone in my vicinity to hurt like that, and really try to understand it? That's how you start to slow suicide down. You don't fear it. You don't run from it. You don't judge it. You don't shame it. You look at it and you say, I see you. I see this darkness. I see that shame, and I'm not going to do that anymore. I'm not going to be the person that is going to throw any more crap on you when you are hurting ever again. I am not going to judge anybody because I do not know what is going on with them on the inside. And it is not my job to judge them. It is my job to love them, to help them, to show them compassion, and to understand better where they're coming from, because people, knowledge and understanding are our greatest superpowers. We can only deal with something and have an opinion on something or a view on something to the perspective that we know it and understand it. And because suicide is so stigmatized and we don't talk about it, there is very little actual understanding and knowledge about it, about what really drives suicide, what's really behind it. And I think with that knowledge and understanding, the more we talk about it, the more knowledge and understanding of it we gain. But everyone is just so afraid to talk about it because it's so taboo. And everyone's like, oh, you can't say the word suicide on social media because it might cause more of an epidemic. People, we have an epidemic. The problem is we're not talking about it. We're not doing what we need to be doing about it, which is stop being jerks on a daily basis. Leave your judgment at home. Again, you do not know what is going on inside of somebody. You know, I nowadays give people the absolute benefit of the doubt until I just can't anymore. I give people as much grace as I can because I know I need it on a daily basis with what I'm going through. And you can only get what you give. So you've got to extend that grace to people, that compassion to people, understanding to people, especially those of us dealing with suicide loss. Not being able to discuss our loss with anyone is so hard. Not being able to be angry at them because then we're being mean to a dead person, or not being able to have our feelings about how they died or what they were going through, and not being able to talk about it with anybody without fear of being judged ourselves for having failed. And trust me, we don't need that crap. I know I was beating myself up enough with it. I was blaming myself. I was shaming myself. I did not need all the other crap from people piling on top of me. That just makes the darkness harder. And in hindsight, that is what I have learned about suicide, is that if we could, in the moment, in that person's moment of darkness, just show love and compassion, not say, I blame you, you're a failure, you messed up, you're a piece of crap, but instead say, I recognize that you are in the darkness. I'm here to do everything I can to help you. And to genuinely mean it and genuinely help. And even if that just looks like, I have nothing to give you but to sit here in the darkness with you and hold you while you break. That's all it takes many times. Now, I'm not saying that that one thing is going to stop suicide in its tracks. Absolutely not. At the end of the day, it is I feel like many times, snap decision made in a moment of pure desperation and darkness. So I don't know that there's any way you can truly, truly stop suicide, but I know that we could slow it down by simply being more compassionate and understanding. And when people that are in that low spot do reach out, when they do say, I am at rock bottom, instead of meeting them with more blame and shame, meet them with, I see you, I'm here to help you. Wow, that could be a real game changer, couldn't it? But sadly, most of the time when we do reach out, you're met with more of the shame and blame. And therefore, it makes reaching out and saying, I am struggling, I am in this darkness, I need help, really hard. Because when you already feel like you have failed, you are at rock bottom, to reach out and say that to someone else, and you're in abject fear that they're going to say that about you too, because most of the time that's what happens. You call and you say, hey, I need help. And people say, I'm too busy, I don't have time, you're just being dramatic, get over it, suck it up, buttercup. No one wants to hear about it. They don't want to deal with it. They don't want to be dirtied by your problems. And unfortunately, that just adds to the darkness. It adds a profound isolation and loneliness to the darkness. It edifies the voices in your head of worthlessness. And then you may say, well, why not call the hotline that keeps popping up in your Google search, right, Sarah? Well, yeah, that's all fine and good. But I know personally, for me, that's not something I would do. That comes with its own set of stigmas and whatnot. You know, you tell people you are having suicidal thoughts and you end up like on a psych hold or something, which ends up on your record and makes it hard to get a job because it makes you look unstable because you were trying to fight a darkness alone. And so I feel like a lot of times people don't feel like calling is a safe option. I would not do that. I call my friends, the people I absolutely know now that I can rely on. But you know, before Jeff died, I did not have that capability. I would not have been able, like him, to say I need help. And I think a lot of people dealing with suicide and dealing with suicide loss, we struggle to say, I need help. I cannot dig my way out of this, because again, we're terrified of being shamed and blamed further, which we're already beating ourselves up with. I mean, has anybody seen a pattern here like I am? Again, suicide and suicide loss are completely wrapped up in these stigmas of worthlessness and weakness and selfishness, but also they are beat to death by shame and blame and judgment. Suicide is all about all of those things. And that is how we stop it, by stopping those things. Stop doing those things. We don't need all the judgment. No one does. We as humans are all going through some shit every single day. Stop throwing judgment and shame around at people. Instead, look at them with the understanding of, you're going through some shit. Like, give grace. Be more compassionate. Just be more understanding of the fact that you probably don't know the entire situation. Be more understanding and empathetic to the fact that everybody has their demons. They all look different, and we all fight them very differently. We don't all have the capability and help that we need to fight these demons. And when it's almost impossible to ask for that help for fear of being struck further, let me tell you, it leaves you in a tough spot. And the best way that we can help each other to get through this is by simply showing some understanding, compassion, and grace for the situation instead of judging it and blaming it. To just be more compassionate, be kinder, be more understanding, be willing to listen to someone's pain and not take it upon yourself, but just take it upon yourself to be understanding of that pain. You don't have to feel it too, but it helps to understand it because somewhere along the way, what that person went through, what that person suffered, may be something that you deal with too. And through their suffering, you will have a little bit more knowledge on how to handle it or how not to handle it. Again, knowledge and understanding are powerful tools that are so underused, especially with suicide, with depression, with mental illness, with failure. We underuse these things. Instead, we use the tools that pierce and hit arteries. Use the ones that shield instead. You have to pick them up at some point. It is not easy. They are heavy. It is hard to stand up when you see a bully and say, I'm not going to allow this. That is not easy. It takes a strength and a knowledge that you have the power behind you to do that. And not many people do. But imagine if you did. Imagine if the crowd was behind you when you stood up to that bully. The knowledge of knowing that somebody has your back, no matter what, no matter whether you are at your best or at your worst, is the most powerful thing. And so few people truly have that. And that is something we can fix. We can have each other's back. We can say, I will stand with you in this darkness. I will hold you while you cry. I will not hurt you further. That would be magical. I can only dream of the difference that that would make in so many people's lives, and very highly likely in the rates we see in suicide. I would love to see what would happen if more people were able to reach out and say, I am at my lowest, I am hurting and I need help. And for people to actually step forward and listen and understand and help. I would love to see the difference that that makes, because I'm pretty sure that it would. So maybe if more of us stepped up and did that, we could really make a difference. I challenge you to try that, to try to really work daily on not casting judgment on people, on not blaming and shaming them, and definitely not doing it to yourself. That was the hardest part for me, was blaming myself, shaming myself, judging myself all of my life, but especially after losing my husband to suicide. And being able to stop that spiral and just say, I did the best I could with what I had. I hate that it wasn't enough. And I wish to God that I knew what I knew now. And it probably would have changed things back then if I had done things differently, but I cannot go back. Having to accept that was hard, but I can move forward and do better. Yes, I failed, but I don't have to fail again. I will learn from my mistakes. I will try harder, but it is so hard to say that to yourself, to pick yourself up when there is no one out there to listen, no one out there to help you. So please try to be the person that can listen, that can help. Because let me tell you, fighting the darkness alone is difficult. It is hard. It is scary. But I do promise you this, you can make that darkness a little less scary for someone by simply being there for them. It may not save them. It may not change them, but it definitely won't add to their hurt. And in that darkness, that's what's most important. Don't add to the hurt. Be the light in the darkness for someone. Be the one who stands with someone in the darkness and says, I have your back. And let's just see if we can't kick suicide's ass a little bit. I know suicide and suicide loss are very difficult subjects to discuss, but that's how we're going to beat them, is by discussing them. And I am tired of standing in the fear and shame of them and not talking about them, because I know that we cannot get past it if we don't understand it better. And we have to talk about it to do that. So please allow people the grace and the space to do that, to do it openly and fearlessly, so that we can defeat this epidemic, especially among our children, which is a whole nother episode. So please continue to follow along here at Widow Wit and Wisdom. I can't wait to see you again, and hopefully Marissa will be back with me next week. If you have any questions or comments, you can reach out to us at widowwitandwisdom@gmail.com, and we look forward to seeing you again really soon. Hang in there and be the light in somebody's darkness.